What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Rustomod Garage. In the previous episodes, you saw us measure our 1950 Willys Wagon and then cut our Jeep Wrangler frame that we're going to put underneath of it to extend the length of it so that way we can put a modern chassis underneath this 1950 Willys that we're building. So now that we got the whole thing welded up, we need to do a little bit more welding modifications to it so we can begin to fit the body onto our new frame. So if you saw the previous episodes, we just sandblasted this frame because it was really rusted and ended up our spring perches were rotted out, and so we ended up ordering some new ones. And so I'm going to just cut off the old ones and then fit up the new ones that we have ordered, and then we're going to weld those things on so that way our frame should be dialed in so that we can begin mounting the body onto our new Wrangler frame.
All right, so we got these pieces welded in here. Looks pretty good. And then this one welded in, so that should be good.
So now that I got those pieces welded in, I ended up painting the rest of the spots where we had to weld so it won't rust. As you can see where we extended it in the previous episode, looks pretty good. If you have to look pretty closely to be able to tell that we ended up cutting it and extending it 11 inches. So now the only thing that we have left to do is move our frame underneath of our lift, put the Willys body back up on the lift here, move it underneath of our lift and set it down so we can see what all is going to interfere with our body. So now is our moment of truth to see how well our modifications have worked out so far. Obviously we have to get it in the right spot so that everything is lined up, and now we can start to lower it down to see what interferences we're going to have with the body, with our frame. Now we are going from a leaf spring frame to a coil spring frame, so the geometry of some of the suspension points and some of the coil spring stuff is going to interfere, and we kind of know that right off the bat. So as you can see, our first hurdle here is the shock and the interference that the coil spring mount has with the inner fender of the Willys body. It hits the fender pretty well there, so we're probably going to have to trim that out, and then we can go lower our body down a little bit further. It also hits our power steering box here, and it's really close to the driver's side coil spring mount as well. So we're going to have to try to address some things, do a little bit of trimming to be able to set the body down further. Alright, so now that we got those two pieces trimmed out, our radiator we left in there just to see if we could use the same mounts, but we're ending up going to have to remove the radiator because that mount on the bottom hits the steering box. So that's not a big deal. We yank that out, and then we can finally lower it down to see what other frame members interfere with our body. So we're lowering it down, checking everything out, and trying to figure out where everything is going to sit, because we're trying to have a 50-year-old car meet with a 10-year-old frame, so it's definitely a bit of a challenge, but it's surprising how many things actually still line up. Like this front mount on the Wrangler actually lines up almost perfect with the original Jeep Willys front core support mount. So we used that mark to line up the rest of the frame, and it actually went pretty smooth after that.
Alright, so we're trying to line this front mount up. So the Jeep originally had a mount on the front of the core support, and the new Jeep also has a mount here. So we're trying to line that up because it seems like it's in a very similar place. And then we trimmed our fender liner out here so we can do our shock in, and then the power steering lines, we had to trim just for them also. But once we did that, it seems to fit pretty good. So the only other trimming we have to do probably is on the back. Try to get the back frame up in there.
So you can kind of see the original shape of the Willys frame actually was very similar to the Wrangler frame, and they both kick up in the same spot, but the Wrangler frame is actually a little bit narrower than the Willys frame. So we're going to have to end up notching the frame on the one side. So you can see on this side the body is just sitting on top of the frame member here, And so what we're gonna have to do is just slice the frame in half and then have a little bit section so the body can sit down into our Wrangler frame. Not a big deal, so we're going to have to raise it back up and start cutting the frame here to be able to modify that section. But of course, with our luck and perfect timing, whenever we go to raise the Jeep up for the time that we're going to cut it and finally fit it down, our lift ends up exploding all over the floor and our hydraulic seals end up blowing out.
Well, we're trying to get it lined up and our lift just exploded all over the floor. So probably not going to be able to work on this anytime soon.
Now with our Jeep barely on the frame, we push it outside so that way it can be out of the way of the lift, so we can get a forklift in there to raise it up, so that way we can get all the pressure off of the seals and we can get tension off of it, so that way we can get the leaky cylinders out, and that way we can try to see if we can send them out to get repaired, or maybe we can try to take them apart and repair them ourselves. So this is what they look like, just a roller on the end of it, and there's both end up leaking. They've been leaking for a little bit, but they finally gave out right at the right time. So of course it's a weekend and nobody's open to have any parts, so we ended up just pulling it apart ourselves to see what the problem was, and ended up that green seal was bad. But luckily we had an O-ring that was the same diameter, so we slapped that in just to get us by on this build. So hopefully that the lift would be functional enough for us to just get it up in the air so we can finish our Willys project here. So we weren't really sure if this was going to work because the design of the O-ring is different than the one that was in there, but it ended up working perfectly. So now we can finally get to lifting the Jeep back up in the air and then trimming everything that we need to trim, so that way we can lower the body onto the frame and finally fit it up for the first time under its full weight.
So this little wheel well tub here, based on the old frame obviously, the inside measurement of that. This new frame is actually narrower in the back. So you see this white line here, just the inside here. That's approximately where the old frame would be. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut down in here, notch this out to go down pretty much like that on an angle, and then kick that out. So what we're going to do before we weld it all in is we'll cut a piece of steel plate, weld it to the inside here to reinforce this so we don't lose any strength, because we are right at the spring here. But that's the good thing, everything from behind here doesn't get loaded at all, other than a body mount that's there. This is apparently is what they do with all the LJ frames as well, is they you know, they're the same width as a TJ, which is what we have. So we're going to notch it down and over, and then this will mimic the original frame width, and you should drop down in here.
Alright, so now we can just use our plasma cutter to cut out the section that we need. That way we can have clearance for the Jeep body to fit inside of our Jeep frame. So we got the first side cut, and that's what it looks like. So we'll just go back and plate that in, reinforce it, and it should be good to go. But that's what it looks like so far.
And this is a piece of aluminum, of course, just using that as a guide. But so what we'll do is put a piece of plate in here on the side. We'll go as wide as we can make it, and we'll run it down around the bend there, and then we'll scab this angle in, trim that up, and we should be plenty good. We're not planning on rock bouncing.
Alright, so we got everything cut out, so now we're going to try to fit it back down on the frame.
So now we put all of our work to the test, and we can have a working lift that goes up and down and finally fit our Jeep body onto the frame that we modified to see if everything lines up. and it should live in its home until we can get some cab mounts and everything else lined up.
Alright, so finally got this thing trimmed out. Little bits like the power steering lines, and then the steering was hitting, and then these motor mounts were hitting a little bit, so finally got all this trimmed down enough. And the back. Start on the inside of this side also. So that's pretty much what it's gonna be.
Alright, and that's it. So our 1950 Willys is finally sitting on its Jeep Wrangler chassis. It was a little bit of a struggle with the lift there in the middle, but we finally got it done. If you guys like videos like this, make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe so you can see what we're going to do next on this Jeep project. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Probably take this.